Alright, so picture this. King Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, sitting on a throne surrounded by unimaginable wealth, luxury, and power. Sounds incredible, right? But here's the thing, his story isn't just about riches or wisdom. It's also a cautionary tale about how easily the heart can drift away from what really matters. Today, we're diving into 1 Kings chapter 10, exploring Solomon's triumphs, his temptations, and the slippery slope that comes when success and pride take over. Stick around, it's eye-opening stuff. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning of Solomon's reign, and honestly, it's kind of fascinating. Solomon becomes king after his dad, David, passes away. And here's the thing, he's really young. I mean, scholars argue a bit whether he was 17, 18, or maybe 19. But either way, this is a teenager suddenly thrust into one of the most intense jobs you could imagine, ruling an entire kingdom. Can you even picture that? Like, you're trying to navigate high school, and here he is, suddenly in charge of Israel. It's wild. But here's the thing that makes Solomon stand out right away. He's wise beyond his years, and he recognizes that he doesn't have all the answers. He's faced with an enormous responsibility, and instead of asking God for wealth, power, or a long life, Solomon asks for wisdom. Not just a little wisdom either, but the kind that would help him govern the people justly and make good decisions for the nation. And, you know, that's huge because it's so counterintuitive. Imagine having the option to ask for anything: gold, success, fame, maybe even the ability to win every argument you ever have, and he asks for understanding instead. That's like, I don't know, going to a genie and saying, please help me be smart so I don't mess everything up. And God, he responds in kind. He's pleased with Solomon's request because it's selfless, focused on the greater good rather than personal gain. So not only does Solomon get the wisdom he asked for, but God also blesses him with all these other things he didn't even think to ask for: riches, honor, and a reputation that spreads far and wide. Basically, he becomes one of the most influential men on the planet. His fame is such that people from distant lands hear about him, talk about him, and start coming to see for themselves. And okay, I have to pause here. Can you imagine being that young and suddenly having this level of fame? It's mind-blowing. But here's where things start to get tricky, because with all these blessings, wisdom, wealth, honor, influence, there's also a risk. And this is where the human part of the story kicks in. Even the wisest people, the ones who start off with the best intentions, can mess things up if pride gets in the way. See, blessings themselves aren't bad. God gives them as gifts, and they're meant to be used for good. But there's a flip side. If you start measuring your worth, your power, or your identity based on what you have instead of where it comes from, well, that's when things start to slip. Solomon had this incredible opportunity to use his blessings to glorify God, lead wisely, and create a legacy rooted in righteousness. And for a while, he does exactly that. His early decisions, his dedication to wisdom, the way he governs, it's all admirable. People notice, the kingdom prospers, and it's a reminder that blessings, when handled with humility, can amplify the good in the world, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. But let's talk a little about that human tendency to let blessings turn into something else. You know, when something good comes along and you start thinking, well, I earned this. I deserve this. This is all because of me. That's the subtle trap. And it's subtle because it doesn't happen overnight. Solomon's early reign shows us what happens when someone starts with pure intentions. He asks for wisdom, and God gives him not only wisdom, but all the other benefits. But blessings can be a test as much as a reward. You can have all the wisdom in the world, all the riches, and all the fame. But if your heart shifts from humility to pride, those same blessings can become a snare. That's the tension in Solomon's story. It's thrilling, but also cautionary. It's kind of like watching someone with a fast car who has never driven one before. At first, they're careful, mindful, and focused. But give them time, and maybe a little overconfidence creeps in. Suddenly, the same car that was exciting and empowering can become dangerous. That's exactly what the early blessings of Solomon foreshadow. The wisdom is a gift, the wealth is a gift, and the fame is a gift, but the human heart left unchecked can get carried away. So as we look at Solomon here in these early chapters, it's a mixture of awe and reflection. You've got this young king, blessed beyond measure, who starts off in the right place, asking for the things that matter. And it's inspiring because it shows us what it looks like to seek God first, to prioritize understanding and justice over personal gain. But it's also a gentle warning, a heads up that the same blessings can become a pitfall if we lose sight of the source. The narrative really invites us to think, if someone as wise as Solomon can be given everything and still eventually stumble, what does that mean for the rest of us? It's both a story of hope and a story of caution, and it sets the stage for everything that comes next in his reign, the triumphs, the temptations, and the eventual challenges that follow when the heart strays. And that, I think, is what makes the start of Solomon's reign so compelling. It's not just history, it's a mirror, a story that asks us to check our own hearts as we navigate our own blessings and responsibilities. Alright, so now we get to one of the most famous parts of Solomon's story, the visit of the Queen of Sheba. And honestly, this is where things get really interesting, not just because of the opulence and grandeur, but because it gives us a real glimpse into human curiosity and admiration. So, picture it, this queen, a powerful woman in her own right, hears about Solomon. And I mean, she hears big things, his wisdom, his riches, the way he governs his kingdom. And remember, this is in a time with no internet, no TV, no social media. Word spreads slowly, mostly by travelers and merchants, yet somehow Solomon's reputation reaches her. That's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, right? Without modern communication, the buzz about him was huge. So she decides she wants to see it for herself. And here's the thing, she comes not just with curiosity, but with a very significant entourage. The text says she comes with camels carrying spices, gold, and precious stones. Like, seriously, she doesn't show up empty-handed. And honestly, I think that's pretty natural, right? If you're traveling to meet a renowned leader, especially someone rumored to be the wisest man alive, you'd bring gifts. It's part of diplomacy, but also there's a subtle acknowledgement of the grandeur she's about to encounter. When she arrives, the story starts with her asking Solomon questions. And here's the interesting part. She doesn't just ask trivial things, she brings her tough questions, things she genuinely wants answers to. She's testing his wisdom, sure, but in a very human way. It's like when you meet someone you've heard so much about, you're naturally skeptical, right? You think, okay, I've heard all these stories, but do they really live up to the hype? And Solomon, he answers everything she asks without hesitation. Nothing is too difficult for him. And that, my friends, is part of what made him so remarkable. He had this ability to meet curiosity head on, to engage with questions that might have stumped others, and to do so with wisdom and grace. But it's not just about the questions. The narrative specifically says that she observed everything, so there's this twofold reaction, hearing and seeing. She hears about his fame and wisdom, but then she actually sees it with her own eyes. She walks through his palace, sees the food prepared, the way his servants are dressed, the grandeur of the architecture, the service, even the way everything is organized. And the text says, quite literally, that she was breathless. I mean, think about that for a second. Not just impressed, not just polite, but literally overwhelmed. It's almost like she couldn't even catch her breath because the reality was far beyond what she had imagined. And here's where the story gives us a lesson that's really easy to miss if we just skim the words. The difference between what people hear and what they actually see can be huge. Solomon's fame had reached her ears. Sure, but it had been understated compared to the reality. And isn't that true in life as well? We often make judgments based on what we hear. Rumors, or secondhand stories, but until we see something ourselves, we can't truly understand it. The Queen of Sheba experiences that firsthand. What she heard didn't even come close to the full picture. And it's a gentle reminder for us, observations matter. They carry weight. They're often more accurate than mere reputation. Now, as she continues to look around, she acknowledges Solomon's wisdom and prosperity. She even comments on how happy his officials and servants must be, standing continually before a king like him, hearing his wisdom, and she attributes all of this, not just to Solomon, but to the Lord, saying that the Lord had delighted in Solomon and loved Israel. That's a big deal because she's a foreigner. She doesn't worship the God of Israel. She's not even part of their culture, yet she recognizes divine blessing in what she sees. That's the power of a life that's lived with purpose, integrity, and, at least at this point, humility, when your life reflects something greater than yourself. Even those who don't share your faith can notice. Isn't that fascinating? You can't hide the influence of the divine when it's working through someone, and the Queen of Sheba sees it. But let's talk about her gifts for a minute, because this part is almost like reading a story from a fantasy novel. She brings Solomon 120 talents of gold, which, if you do the math in modern terms, is a mind-boggling amount. Millions of pounds of gold. And then there are the spices and precious stones. She brings everything she can to honor him, to show respect, and perhaps also to solidify her own position diplomatically. It's a reminder of the magnitude of Solomon's wealth and influence at that time. He's not just wise, he's established, secure, and prosperous, and that combination of wisdom and resources makes an impression that is unforgettable. And yet, while it's awe-inspiring, it also sets the stage for some of the pitfalls to come. Because you see, part of the fascination here is that people are drawn to the visible signs of blessing: gold, wealth, luxurious palaces. And while that can be a testimony, it can also be dangerous if the heart begins to find its confidence in what is seen rather than in God. That's subtle but important. Even as the Queen of Sheba marvels, we're getting a hint of the slippery slope. A person blessed with so much, even a wise person, can start to focus more on the gifts than the giver. Back to her visit, she speaks with him directly about all that's in her heart, and Solomon answers her thoroughly. There's no stammering, no evasion, no pretending. Everything she asks is met with insight. And then she observes the things that had probably made the rumors sound so grand. The palace, the food, the servants, the ceremonial order of everything. And her reaction, total amazement. She says that what she heard was true, but the half of it wasn't even told. Can you imagine? She had literally experienced only half of what could be observed and was already overwhelmed. That's the story's way of showing how far Solomon's wisdom and prosperity reached. And here's a little reflection moment. Isn't that a powerful point for us? What people see about us, the life we live, can speak louder than any words. Reputation is one thing, but real observation, the way people actually experience your life, has a deeper impact. The Queen of Sheba didn't just hear about Solomon, she saw it. And that left an impression she couldn't ignore. Her life and decisions were influenced by what she saw. Similarly, our actions, our character, and how we handle blessings and responsibilities will speak to those around us, sometimes louder than any words we could say. So, in a way, the Queen of Sheba's visit isn't just a story of wealth and curiosity. It's a lesson in perception, humility, and the power of a life that truly reflects wisdom and integrity. She saw the tangible results of Solomon's early obedience and devotion, and it left her breathless. And even as we marvel at the gold, the spices, and the exotic gifts, there's a deeper message. The combination of wisdom, humility, and godly influence is what creates a lasting impression. The grandeur impresses, but the wisdom and heart behind it inspire. And that's the part of the story that resonates beyond history. It's about the human response to true excellence and the divine working through someone. So yeah, the Queen of Sheba's visit is awe-inspiring, and it gives us a lot to think about. It's a reminder that what people hear about us is just a fraction of the story, but what they see can leave a lasting mark. And it's also a subtle, kind of cautionary note. As impressive as blessings and prosperity are, they can only truly be a testimony when they're rooted in wisdom and humility. Solomon's story at this point is a mix of wonder and foreshadowing, setting up both the heights of success and the potential pitfalls that come with it. Stick with me, because there's a lot more to unravel as his story continues, and the lessons only get richer from here. Okay, so let's dive into just how massive Solomon's wealth really got, because honestly, it's mind-blowing. And when I say massive, I mean we're talking quantities of gold, spices, and exotic items that make even modern billionaires look, well, normal. So after his early wisdom and the visit of the Queen of Sheba, Solomon's kingdom wasn't just prospering, it was exploding with material abundance. We're not talking a little extra here and there. I'm talking ships, caravans, treasures pouring in from every corner of the known world. It's like the ultimate ancient display of opulence. Let's start with the Queen of Sheba, because she kind of sets the tone. She comes loaded with gifts, gold, spices, precious stones. Just the gold alone, 120 talents. And okay, if you've ever wondered how heavy a talent is, it's about 70 pounds per talent. So, quick math, 120 times 70 pounds, and we're talking 8,400 pounds of gold, literally tons. And in today's market, with gold at roughly $2,500 an ounce, that translates to, brace yourself, over $336 million worth of gold, just from one visit. And don't forget the spices and gemstones. I mean, it's like the ultimate gift basket on steroids. It's over the top, and that's kind of the point. Solomon's wealth wasn't just impressive, it was overwhelming. But that was just the beginning, because the biblical account tells us that the ships of Hiram, the king of Tyre, were bringing back more gold from a place called Ophir. Now, nobody knows exactly where Ophir was, somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula, maybe even Africa, but they were bringing back almug wood, precious stones, gold, and other exotic items. And Solomon used the almug wood for building, for crafting musical instruments, and for decorating his palace and the temple. Just imagine the logistics. These weren't just trips down the block, they were multi-year voyages, fraught with danger and planning, but the returns were spectacular, and Solomon's empire was swimming in wealth. And then there's the recurring accumulation. Year after year, Solomon's income from gold alone is staggering, 666 talents every year, not counting what came from traveling merchants or gifts from other kings. Do the math again, each talent is 70 pounds. That's 46,620 pounds of gold annually. In modern terms, we're talking almost $2 billion every single year. Like, can you even wrap your head around that? That's more money than some countries generate in a year, and it's coming straight into Solomon's treasury. And of course, this isn't just for him personally. It funded the kingdom, the administration, the temple, the palace, yet it also started to create this sense of invincibility. And here's the thing, this is where the slippery slope begins. You've got incredible blessings, but the human heart can start to focus on the gifts instead of the giver. That's the tension we see creeping in, and it's not just gold. Solomon's palace, called the House of the Forest of Lebanon, was adorned with hundreds of shields of hammered gold. Some were enormous, 200 large shields with 600 shekels of gold in each, and another 300 smaller shields with 3 minas of gold apiece. These weren't practical, they were ornamental, symbols of status and power. And then the throne itself, made of ivory and overlaid with pure gold, elevated on 6 steps, adorned with lions. Everything screamed luxury. And just to paint the picture, every drinking vessel in the palace was gold. No silver, no mixed metals, pure gold. Can you imagine trying to do your dishes with that? The extravagance is almost comical, but it also shows the shift in focus, from governance to glory, from service to spectacle, and it didn't stop there. Solomon had merchant ships at sea, making 3-year voyages to bring back more treasures: gold, silver, ivory, apes, monkeys. Yes, monkeys. He literally imported exotic animals as part of his display of wealth. It's like a real-life Jungle Book. And he had a stable of chariots and horses, 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen stationed strategically across the kingdom. This is important because God had actually instructed Israel's kings not to multiply horses for themselves or return to Egypt to acquire them, but Solomon's accumulation shows the pattern. More horses, more chariots, more power, more wealth, all gradually moving his focus away from dependence on God. So, when you step back and look at the scale, it's almost hard to comprehend. Ships bringing gold and exotic goods, mountains of gold being poured into the treasury, extravagant palaces, ceremonial shields, thrones, and every conceivable luxury you could imagine. This was a man whose wealth and possessions were so extreme that they dominated his life. And that's exactly the point. Wealth itself isn't inherently wrong. Money, gifts, and material success are neutral. They can be used for incredible good. But the story of Solomon here is a cautionary tale. The more he accumulated, the more tempting it became to trust in these things instead of God. You can almost see it happening, like watching someone slowly get seduced by their own blessings. It's gradual, subtle, and easy to justify at first. One gift here, one acquisition there, and suddenly, the kingdom revolves around the king's possessions and status instead of justice, wisdom, and devotion to God. And we see this shift reflected not just in the sheer numbers, but in the psychology of it all. Imagine having nearly unlimited resources at your disposal. How easy is it to start believing you're invincible, that your wisdom, wealth, and power are all self-generated, that you're untouchable? That's the slippery slope. God's warnings, like those in Deuteronomy about not multiplying gold, silver, horses, or wives, weren't meant to limit enjoyment. They were protective measures for the heart. The more Solomon accumulated outside of divine guidance, the more his heart could drift. And as we'll see later, this gradual shift sets the stage for bigger compromises and deeper failures. It starts with treasures and luxuries and leads to attachment and misplaced trust. So, the story of Solomon's material acquisitions is as much psychological as it is historical. We marvel at the scale, the numbers, the modern equivalents, the exotic luxuries, but the underlying lesson is human. Blessings, when they dominate our focus, can begin to erode dependence on God. Solomon had the chance to lead a kingdom wisely, humbly, and faithfully, and for a while, he did. But the more he amassed, the more tempting it became to let wealth and success define him instead of guiding his heart toward God. It's fascinating and cautionary, showing us how even wisdom and blessing, if mismanaged, can become a kind of trap. And that's why this part of the story is so engaging. We can almost visualize Solomon surrounded by gold, spices, and rare animals, standing in his magnificent palace, realizing, or maybe not fully realizing, how extraordinary his life had become. The numbers are staggering, the gifts are lavish, the exotic items are unbelievable, and yet underlying it all is a subtle tension, the risk of losing perspective, the risk of letting the blessings take the place of God. It's like watching a slow motion tipping point. We admire the abundance, but we also feel the foreboding of what's to come. That combination of awe and caution is what makes this section of Solomon's story so compelling. And it's a timeless reminder that the way we handle blessings matters more than the blessings themselves. Alright, so now we're entering a really pivotal part of Solomon's story. This is where the slippery slope starts to show itself in very clear ways. Remember how we talked about all that wealth, all the gifts, all the gold, spices, and exotic items piling up? Well, here's the catch. God had given very clear instructions to Israel's kings long before Solomon even came to power. Specifically, God said don't multiply horses for yourself, don't accumulate wives for yourself, and don't stockpile silver and gold beyond what's necessary. Sounds reasonable, right? I mean, it's like a guide to keep a king from getting distracted or letting pride creep in. But Solomon, well, he kind of started bending the rules. And okay, let's unpack this because it's really fascinating and also a little bit shocking. Let's start with the horses. God said no multiplying horses, especially importing them from Egypt, which makes sense historically because Egypt was this superpower and a potential temptation. But Solomon doesn't just get a few horses. He amasses 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen strategically stationed across the kingdom. That's a lot of horsepower, literally. And if you pause to think about it, the average person reading this might go, wait, that's like having an entire national cavalry and then some. And yeah, that's exactly what it was. Horses and chariots weren't just for show, they were military power. But here's the thing, accumulating them wasn't just about defense. It was about status and influence and honestly, a little bit of ego flexing. And that's where small compromises start. God's instruction was designed to protect the heart, to keep reliance on him. By adding all these horses, Solomon begins trusting in something tangible, military strength, rather than God. It's subtle at first, but it's a classic example of how small disobedience can snowball. Now, let's talk about silver and gold. God's warning wasn't meant to prevent prosperity, but to prevent the heart from idolizing wealth. And Solomon? Yeah. He definitely went overboard. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar trees as plentiful as sycamores. I mean, imagine walking through a city where silver is everywhere. It's almost like the city is glittering. And that's the thing, it's not just wealth, it's abundance that starts to redefine what security and success mean. Do you feel that subtle shift, where wealth becomes more than a blessing? It becomes a measure of power and identity. Again, God's point was protection, but Solomon's accumulation signals the heart beginning to lean on material things. It starts small, like, oh, a few extra shields, a few more talents of gold, and before you know it, it's a mountain of wealth and luxury that can easily take center stage in life. And then we get to wives, which is perhaps the most dramatic example. God specifically warned against multiplying wives because it could turn the heart away from him. Solomon, he didn't just take a few extra wives on the side. He went all in, 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's like completely over the top. I mean, can you even imagine the logistics of that? Just the closet space, the household management, the arguments over the thermostat, and let's be honest, it's a huge red flag about the heart. This isn't just about a number, it's about attachment and distraction. And God's warning wasn't arbitrary, it was protective. These marriages weren't just political alliances, they came with influence from pagan nations, bringing in foreign gods and religious practices, and that's exactly what happened. The small compromise of accepting foreign marriages snowballed into something much bigger, a heart divided, distracted, and ultimately turned away from God. And here's a reflection moment. Isn't that so human? Small compromises often seem harmless at first. A little bending of the rules, a little indulgence in what we know isn't aligned with our principles. But over time, those little choices accumulate. They shape priorities and desires in ways we often don't realize until it's too late. Solomon's story is basically a case study in this. Horses, silver, gold, wives, they each seem manageable in isolation, but add them together, layer upon layer, and suddenly the heart shifts. And it's fascinating because you can almost see the pattern. What starts as a seemingly minor relaxation of God's commands becomes a full-blown misalignment of priorities. And it's subtle. It doesn't happen overnight. It creeps in, like water slowly seeping into a crack, until the whole foundation is compromised. Let's take a closer look at the wives, because they really illustrate the principle of small compromises turning into major failures. Solomon didn't just marry these women, he allowed them to influence him spiritually. Many of them worshipped other gods, and over time, Solomon's heart began to drift. The small compromise, marrying for alliance or pleasure, led to a bigger failure, idolatry. That's exactly the point God was warning about. And here's the human side of it. It's easy to rationalize. Oh, this is just a political marriage. This is just a tradition. But the consequence is real. Small decisions, if repeated and rationalized, can create patterns that completely divert the heart from what's right. And in Solomon's case, it's a dramatic example because his choices affected not just him, but an entire nation. It's like the butterfly effect of disobedience. Tiny initial compromises creating massive downstream consequences. And while we can't ignore the wealth and horses, it's important to notice the pattern here. Each of these was a seemingly separate area, but they all contributed to the same problem. The wealth fed pride and self-reliance. The horses and chariots fed a sense of military security independent of God. And the wives introduced spiritual influences that diverted his heart. Alone, each one might have been manageable, but together, they created a tipping point. And that's such a vivid lesson for all of us. It's easy to compartmentalize life, like, oh, that little compromise over here doesn't affect the big picture. But often, it does. And sometimes, it accumulates silently until the heart is far from where it started. There's also a sort of human irony here. Solomon starts with wisdom, asking God for understanding. He's blessed abundantly because of his selfless request. And yet, all these blessings, wealth, influence, power, resources, become the very tools of distraction. It's a cautionary tale about how even the most intelligent, wise, or well-intentioned person can slip if the heart isn't guarded. And the storytelling really drives that home, doesn't it? We read about the numbers, the gold, the horses, the wives, and it's almost surreal. And yet, underneath it all is a spiritual principle that's timeless. Blessings, privileges, and freedom must be paired with humility, discipline, and dependence on God. Otherwise, they can subtly redirect the heart toward pride, self-reliance, or misplaced trust. And let's be honest, there's a little humor in all of this too. I mean, the logistics alone, hundreds of chariots, tens of thousands of horsemen, hundreds of wives and concubines. How do you even manage that? Who's keeping track of all the inventory? And yet, the humor isn't just for comic relief, it helps make the lesson relatable. Because if you look at the absurdity of it, you realize how easily human nature can get carried away. Solomon, wise as he was, wasn't immune, and that's exactly the point. He starts small, and it builds. Horses, wealth, wives, they're all fine in moderation, but when accumulated outside of God's guidance, they become a trap. And that's the story we need to pay attention to. The early warnings, the small compromises, the gradual drift that leads to spiritual and moral consequences. So as we reflect on this, the big takeaways are really clear. First, small compromises matter. They're not just minor infractions, they shape the heart over time. Second, blessings and resources, when mismanaged, can lead to misplaced trust and pride. And third, obedience and humility are protective. God's instructions weren't arbitrary. They were designed to prevent the heart from being swayed by power, wealth, or distraction. Solomon had it all: wisdom, wealth, fame. And yet, the combination of small compromises set the stage for significant failures. It's a lesson that resonates across history and into our own lives. How are we handling the blessings in our lives? Are small compromises slowly shifting our priorities? Are we guarding our hearts or letting wealth, status, or pleasure define our trust? And that's really the power of this part of the story. And it's not just a historical account, it's a mirror. We can see ourselves in these patterns. Solomon's story is almost like a slow-motion example of how easily the human heart can drift, even for someone exceptionally wise. It's both fascinating and cautionary, showing us the subtle power of small choices and the importance of intentional dependence on God. Horses, silver, gold, wives. They might seem like external things, but they reveal what's happening internally. And that's the spiritual lesson we need to carry forward. Small compromises today can shape the trajectory of our hearts tomorrow. Solomon's story invites us to be vigilant, to reflect, and to guard against the gradual drift that can come from wealth, power, and unguarded desires. Alright, so now we're entering a really intense part of Solomon's story. This is where things start to take a serious turn, and it's honestly kind of heartbreaking. We've seen him blessed with incredible wisdom, unimaginable wealth, and influence that reached far beyond Israel. But here's the thing, even the wisest man alive isn't immune to the human heart's vulnerability, and that becomes really clear with his marriages to foreign women. Solomon didn't just take a few wives from neighboring nations, he took 700 wives and 300 concubines. Yeah, you heard that right. 700 wives and 300 concubines. Pause for a second. 700. Can you even imagine that kind of household? The logistics, the management, the politics alone must have been insane. But more importantly, this wasn't just a matter of numbers. These marriages had spiritual consequences. Many of these women came from pagan nations, and they brought their gods, their rituals, their religious practices with them. And gradually, these influences began to seep into Solomon's life. Small compromises, right? It starts with a marriage, a diplomatic alliance, perhaps even a genuine desire to connect with these people. But then, the heart begins to shift. And that's the subtle danger here. The drift is almost imperceptible at first, and we see the consequences play out over time. The Bible tells us that Solomon's heart was turned away from the Lord, not immediately, not in a dramatic, sudden fall, but slowly. That's the really chilling part. You can almost see it happening. First a small worship here, a compromise there, perhaps a little indulgence in practices he knows aren't right. And then, as more wives exert influence, more foreign gods are introduced, more rituals take place. And suddenly, Solomon is no longer fully devoted to the Lord. His heart, the very core of his decision-making and devotion, is being pulled in different directions. And that's so human, isn't it? We often think of spiritual drift as something that happens with huge, obvious mistakes. But here, it's a gradual shift, tiny decisions adding up, until the heart is far from where it started. And it's not just abstract spiritual drift. Solomon actually begins to participate in idolatry. He builds high places, altars, and shrines to these foreign gods. One of the most shocking examples is Molech, the god of the Ammonites, which tragically involved child sacrifice. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts show that idols of Molech were hollow, heated from within, and children were offered in horrific ceremonies. I know, it's horrifying to even imagine. And here's Solomon, once the wisest man alive, allowing this to happen under his reign. The text tells us that he built high places for Molech and other foreign gods right in full view, even near Jerusalem. It's not hidden, it's prominent, and that's the real tragedy. Small compromises led to huge moral and spiritual failures. Now, let's pause for a second and reflect. It's tempting to read this and think, wow, Solomon was just uniquely flawed, or that could never happen to me. But the lesson here is universal. Our hearts are influenced by what we allow into our lives, relationships, environments, habits. Solomon's story is extreme, sure, but it illustrates a principle that's relatable to all of us. Even someone exceptionally wise, gifted, and blessed can be led astray if the heart is not guarded. It starts with small shifts, tolerating something we shouldn't, compromising on a principle, allowing influences that subtly pull us in a different direction. And before you know it, the heart is divided. And there's another layer here, the impact on the people around him. Solomon's heart turning away from God didn't just affect him, it affected the entire nation. Leaders set the tone. When the king turns to idolatry, it sends a message to the people that God is not central, that other gods or practices are acceptable, and that has real consequences. Israel, which had been established under God's guidance, begins to experience the ripple effects of this divided heart. It's a reminder that our personal decisions, especially those in positions of influence, have far-reaching effects, and sometimes we underestimate that. We think, oh, it's just me. But there's always a sphere of influence, and Solomon's sphere was an entire kingdom. Let's look at the progression. First, Solomon marries foreign women. Then, he tolerates their worship. Then, he builds altars in high places. And then, tragically, he allows practices that are abominable, like child sacrifice, to take place. It's a chain reaction, and it's really a clear demonstration of how small compromises can spiral into serious failures. And the storytelling here is important. It's not a dry moral lesson. It's a story we can visualize, almost feel. The massive palace, the exotic wives, the ceremonial altars, the lavish gifts, the subtle drift of priorities. All of it shows the human side of spiritual failure. And what's interesting is how gradual it is. Solomon starts with wisdom, devotion, and humility, but the accumulation of wealth, power, and relationships, especially those that introduce competing influences, slowly reshapes his heart. And that's a key point. Often, we think of failure as abrupt, but spiritual drift is usually a slow process. Tiny, seemingly harmless decisions add up. And in Solomon's case, they led to catastrophic results. His heart, which should have been fully devoted to God, became divided. And that division opened the door to behaviors and practices that were completely against God's commands. Now, the story also makes a contrast with David, Solomon's father. David had his flaws. No one forgets the story of Bathsheba, but even in his sins, David was quick to repent and seek God's mercy. Solomon, on the other hand, does not demonstrate the same humility or repentant heart in this phase. He allows the compromises to solidify into patterns, and that's a warning for us. Failing to check our hearts and correct small deviations can turn into long-term consequences. It's the difference between a temporary stumble and a permanent drift. And friends. This part of the story is vivid, almost cinematic. You can imagine Solomon's palace, filled with opulent treasures, his wives moving through the halls, altars for foreign gods rising alongside the temple of the Lord. And there's a sense of inevitability as each compromise lays the groundwork for the next. Horses, wealth, foreign wives, idolatry. It's like watching a slow motion chain reaction. And while we might react with shock or horror, the lesson is practical and personal. Guard your heart, pay attention to what influences you, and don't let small compromises go unchecked. It's also worth noting how human and relatable this is. Solomon wasn't evil from the start. He was wise, gifted, and blessed. But like all of us, he had vulnerabilities. The story isn't just about judgment, it's about understanding the mechanisms of spiritual drift, the subtle ways that the human heart can be pulled away from what's right. And that's why the narrative is so compelling. It's not abstract, it's a living example of choices, influences, and consequences. So, as we reflect on Solomon's marriages to foreign women, his heart turning away from God, and his gradual involvement in idolatry, we see several key takeaways. First, small compromises matter. They can lead to far-reaching consequences. Second, influences in our lives, relationships, habits, environments shape our hearts, sometimes without us even realizing it. Third, leadership and influence come with responsibility. Our personal drift can affect others in profound ways. And finally, wisdom and blessing are gifts that require vigilance. Without humility, obedience, and awareness, even the greatest gifts can become the very things that lead us astray. In the end, Solomon's story is both dramatic and cautionary. It shows us how someone so gifted and blessed can gradually move away from the source of their strength. And it asks us to reflect, how are we guarding our hearts? What influences are shaping our decisions? Are we allowing small compromises to creep in? Or are we staying vigilant, relying on God's guidance and keeping our hearts aligned with what truly matters? Solomon's example is a warning, but it's also an invitation to self-reflection. And that's why this part of his story resonates. It's not just about the past, it's about the principles that affect us today. Every single one of us. Alright, so now we're moving into the consequences of Solomon's choices. And this part of the story is, well, intense but also incredibly instructive. We've seen the build-up. Solomon starts with wisdom and humility, then wealth, horses, wives, and slowly, the heart drifts. Eventually, this drift turns into full-blown disobedience. And here's the thing, God doesn't ignore this. Even though Solomon was incredibly gifted and blessed, God is not just sitting back. He starts raising adversaries against him, and the text makes it clear that this is a direct consequence of Solomon turning his heart away from God. First up, we have Hadad the Edomite. Now, this is a guy with a bit of history. When David, Solomon's father, had conducted military campaigns in Edom, Hadad as a young boy had to flee to Egypt after Joab, David's commander, executed the males of Edom. He grows up in Pharaoh's household, marries into the royal family there, and lives comfortably in Egypt for years. But here's where the timing comes in. Once David dies and Joab is dead, Hadad sees an opportunity. He petitions Pharaoh to return to his own country, essentially setting himself up as an adversary to Solomon. And notice the timing. It's precise. God raises Hadad at just the right moment to challenge Solomon, to test the kingdom, and to bring consequences for disobedience. Isn't it interesting how cause and effect unfold here? Solomon's choices, his accumulation of wives, his drift toward idolatry set the stage for adversaries to rise against him. It's almost like a ripple effect. One action leads to another, and eventually, the consequences become unavoidable. And it doesn't stop with Hadad. There's also Rezon, the son of Eliada, who had fled from his own king in Zobah. He gathers men, becomes a captain of raiders, and eventually reigns over Damascus. He's essentially another adversary in the north, creating pressure from multiple fronts. So now you've got Solomon, who has spent years accumulating wealth, horses, wives, and influence, suddenly facing opposition both to the south with Hadad and to the north with Rezon. The kingdom that once seemed invincible is starting to show cracks, and you can almost picture Solomon sitting in his palace, perhaps still dazzled by gold and splendor, but now being reminded that material wealth and personal strength can't substitute for obedience and reliance on God. It's a powerful narrative about accountability and the real-life consequences of drifting from divine guidance. And here's where the story gets really sobering. These adversaries are just the beginning, because the deeper consequence of Solomon's disobedience isn't just enemies on the borders, it's the very future of the kingdom itself. God tells Solomon that because of his turning away, the kingdom will be torn from his son, and eventually, Israel will be divided. This isn't punishment for punishment's sake, it's the natural unfolding of disobedience. Think about it. Solomon amassed great wealth, married foreign wives, allowed idolatry, and neglected God's instructions. The unity and spiritual foundation of the kingdom weakened. When his son takes over, the seeds of division have already been planted, and isn't that a lesson for us? Small compromises, uncorrected, can grow into larger structural problems. It's not just about immediate consequences, it's about how patterns and choices shape the future. So, after Solomon's death, the kingdom splits. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, takes the throne in Judah, while Jeroboam becomes king over the northern tribes. 10 tribes in the north form what becomes the northern kingdom of Israel, and 2 tribes remain in the south as Judah. This division wasn't just political, it was a direct spiritual consequence of Solomon's disobedience. God preserved a part of the kingdom for the sake of David, but the overall structure was fractured. And when you think about it, it's a remarkable example of cause and effect. Decisions made over decades, decisions about wealth, relationships, and worship, culminated in a political and spiritual realignment that lasted for centuries. It's a vivid illustration of how leadership and personal obedience, or the lack thereof, can have generational impact, and it's worth pausing here to reflect. Sometimes when we think about consequences, we think of immediate punishment or reward. But this story shows something more nuanced. The consequences unfold over time, shaped by patterns and choices. Solomon's personal drift and disobedience didn't just affect him, it affected his heirs, his kingdom, and the spiritual trajectory of an entire nation. That's kind of a wake-up call. How we live, how we prioritize, and how we guard our hearts matters not just for ourselves, but for those around us. Small decisions, left unchecked, have long-reaching ramifications. And the Bible uses this story to show exactly how serious that principle is. Let's also look at the adversaries a bit more closely because they're fascinating. Hadad the Edomite isn't just a random enemy. He represents a long-term consequence of earlier decisions. The military campaigns in Edom under David. Rezin, similarly, has been in the background, patient, waiting for the right time. God's orchestration of these adversaries isn't arbitrary, it's strategic, almost surgical, ensuring that Solomon faces challenges that mirror his spiritual drift. It's like God saying, "You had opportunities to remain faithful, to guard your heart, to follow my instructions, and you didn't. Now, the consequences will remind you and your kingdom that reliance on anything other than me is dangerous." And when you reflect on that, it really makes the story come alive. It's not just ancient history, it's a principle about cause and effect, about accountability, about spiritual discipline. And there's another layer to consider. Even though Solomon had these adversaries, the kingdom didn't collapse overnight. God preserved a part of it for the sake of David. That's interesting because it shows mercy alongside discipline. God's justice is real, but so is his grace. He doesn't remove the entire kingdom immediately. There's still an opportunity for reflection, for correction, for learning. But the split is inevitable. And isn't that a profound lesson? Even when consequences are coming, God's mercy can coexist with correction. The kingdom divides, but not completely, showing both accountability and grace in action. Now, think about the human side of this. Imagine being Solomon, facing the mounting pressures from Hadad in the south and Rezin in the north. You've got years of wealth and luxury, hundreds of wives, immense armies, and yet the structural integrity of the kingdom is threatened because of spiritual and moral compromise. The story almost invites us to ask, how often do we accumulate blessings, successes, or advantages in life, but neglect the foundational principles that keep things stable? It's a question worth pondering, because in Solomon's case, the consequences weren't just abstract, they were tangible, political, and generational. And the story also raises a question of timing and inevitability. God raises adversaries at the right time. There's patience in the process, but not indefinite patience. Solomon's choices have long-term consequences, and eventually, those consequences manifest. It's a principle that resonates today. What we do now, especially decisions that compromise values or spiritual principles, will eventually produce results, whether immediate or delayed, and the division of the kingdom is the ultimate proof of that. It's dramatic, yes, but it's logical when you trace the cause and effect back through Solomon's actions. So, in summary, this part of the story is a masterclass in cause and effect. Solomon's disobedience, small compromises, accumulation of wealth, wives, and idolatry sets off a chain of events. God raises adversaries like Hadad and Rezin to challenge him, and ultimately, the kingdom itself is divided after his death. It's a narrative that combines history, spirituality, and human psychology. And it invites reflection. How are we guarding our hearts? How are we considering the long-term consequences of our decisions? Are small compromises today planting seeds that will impact the future in ways we can't yet see? Solomon's story challenges us to think about responsibility, obedience, and the ripple effects of our choices, reminding us that even the wisest and most blessed among us are accountable for the trajectory of their hearts and actions. So, there you have it. Solomon's story is a mix of incredible wisdom, wealth, and cautionary lessons. It's a reminder that even blessings can become a trap if the heart isn't guarded, and that small compromises can lead to bigger consequences. Take a moment to reflect on your own life. What influences are shaping your heart, and where is your dependence? If this story made you think or gave you pause, stick around for more, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep exploring these timeless lessons.